Welcome to this very special event. I'm Randy Shostak, President of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion with Erika Pulley-Hayes, the new General Manager of WAMU 88.5. The Society of Professional Journalists is the nation's most broad-based journalism organization, dedicated to encouraging the free practice of journalism and stimulating high standards of ethical behavior. The SPJ DC chapter supports journalism and journalists throughout the Washington, DC area. The DC chapter, for instance, is working to secure unfettered access for reporters to government news sources, support whistleblowers, and stand up for journalists when they are threatened or their work is interfered with. SPJ DC organizes regular sessions to learn about journalism issues and develop journalism skills. The chapter conducts an annual journalism contest, holds an annual awards dinner, and creates other opportunities for members to socialize. SPJ DC is the host chapter for SPJ's national conference in 2022, so keep your eyes open for that. We welcome all of you to learn more about SPJ and become a member. Information is at our website at www.spjdc.org. Before I introduce tonight's speaker and interviewer, I just want to go over some quick housekeeping notes. Questions from all of you will be accepted throughout the event, so please get ready with your questions and please use the question and answer feature, not the chat feature. Please keep your questions short, and also one other housekeeping event is that, is that the event will be recorded. I want to thank some people for their assistance with this program, including WAMU Chief of Staff, Donita Altieri, an SPJ DC past president, Kathy Burns, for initiating the program, and some SPJ DC board members who worked hard on the program, including Deanne Divis, Dan Kubisky, Amy Fickling, and Catherine Foxhall. I also want to thank the two people who will be sharing the stage, whom I will introduce now. 60 years after its first broadcast, Washington NPR station WAMU 88.5 on the dial is moving to expand its news coverage and reset its relationship with its staff. Erika Pulley-Hayes is the person who is spearheading those changes. A 15-year veteran of public media, she is returning to Washington, D.C. from Orlando, Florida, where she was president and CEO of WMFE and 89.5 WMFV. WAMU announced this spring that it would refocus its coverage to provide more in-depth local news for its more than 1 million listeners. To that end, the station and its digital publication DCist plans to add 8 new full-time news positions to support, quote, an even more robust and collaborative news division, WAMU said in an April statement. Pulley-Hayes worked for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in Washington, D.C. from 2005 to 2020. She was tapped from a field of 130 candidates to replace former WAMU General Manager J.J. Yore. Yore's resignation in August 2020 and broader changes at the station followed, quote, months of unusually public-facing criticism of the station from its own employees, including allegations of workplace toxicity that led to the recent departure of several staffers of color, end quote, according to a DCist news story. In discussion with Erika Pulley-Hayes is Steve Guyman, who was a reporter, editor, manager, and executive for more than 4 decades in newspapers, broadcast, trade publications, and wire services. Guyman managed weekend news coverage of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa for Bloomberg News in London for more than 3 years. After leading coverage of regulation, transportation, politics, and technology from Washington. He joined Bloomberg in 1999 after 5 years as senior editor at the trade newsletter Communication Daily. He also spent 3 years at Bloomberg Radio and spent 11 years at United Press International, where he was executive as well as Washington bureau chief during the 1991 Persian Gulf War. Guyman also was active in SPJ, which he served as president from 1996 to 97. For 2 years, he led SPJ's ethics committee, And for 6 years, he was president of the Society of the Sigma Delta Chi Foundation, which is the educational arm of the society. Gaiman also is a recipient of the Wells Memorial Key, the society's highest honor. With that, I would again like to thank all of you for joining us for the event, and I'd like to turn the floor over to Steve Gaiman.
Thanks a lot, Randy. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Erika.
Good evening, Steve.
WAMU Radio is beginning its 7th decade as one of the premier providers of news and public affairs programs in Washington, D.C. The station signed on in 1961. It offered news, talk, classes, and bluegrass music, along with the weekly vintage radio show for more than 35 years. Then, the American University-owned station shifted to all news and talk in 2002. Today, it ranks 7th among all U.S. news and talk stations, alongside broadcasters in New York, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. It's been a consistent winner of awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, Regional Edward R. Murrow Awards from RTDNA, the Public Media Journalist Association, and other groups. Diane Ream's national talk show began on WAMU. Its successor, the 1A, is now heard on more than 430 radio stations nationwide. But during the summer of 2020, WAMU was in turmoil, the staff in full fury. The previous general manager resigned over his handling of workplace complaints and allegations of inhospitable conditions. A report commissioned by AU said the station faced a moment of reckoning like much of the media industry in the nation. There was an exodus of women of color, allegations of discrimination and racism, and inappropriate behavior that had not been curtailed. That report continued. The culture had become what some described as toxic and mentally unhealthy. Our guest tonight, Erika Pulley-Hayes, arrived at WAMU just 12 weeks ago, just as managers and staff were digesting and implementing the recommendations of that task force report, which was in the works for many months. So Erika, welcome tonight. Welcome back to Washington, and welcome to a station that's going through a major transition. How has it been as you've returned to a new job here in the nation's capital?
Thank you, Steve. That was great. It's been an interesting 3 months since I've been here. I don't kind of surprised to hear you say it's been 12 weeks already, because it certainly feels like yesterday. But you know, I'll be honest, it's been challenging. It's hard. That history that you just reiterated is still somewhat of an open wound, but we're working through it as an organization.
Has it been difficult to take the job with this sort of elephant in the room, probably touching everything that you have to deal with, that you have to get acquainted with?
Yes, it has. It has, you know, when I read about WAMU's challenges in the press a year ago, and I was in Orlando at the time, and I said, "Oh, that's a cleanup job for somebody." But I didn't know that somebody was going to be me. But I'm up for the challenge, and I love this station and I love this city, and I'm willing to put in the work that it takes to get the station where it needs to be.
So for people who have been following the developing story at WAMU, where do you start first? What's the first portion of these recommendations, the task forces, the culture report that they put together? Where do you start as the cleanup?
Yeah, you know, the task force made recommendations that fall in 3 major buckets. One was improving communication and culture. One was, communication and collaboration. One was improving culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then the third was improving the relationship with the university. And so just looking at those 3 buckets, you know, there were some kind of easy tactics that I thought that we could implement more quickly than some of the more rigorous work. You know, so just taking them one by one, we're improving workplace communication by publishing a bi-weekly newsletter with station updates that includes updates from, you know, different operations within the organization, reports from every department that communicates what each department is working on. just really making sure that people are sharing the information across the organization that deserves to be shared. And then on the culture piece, we hired a project manager to help facilitate and keep track of all of the activities that are required to fully implement the task force recommendations. And so she started probably a month ago, just shortly after I did, and she's put together, kind of a project plan for how we incorporate all of these things. And the thing that we tackled first was diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And as you go through this process, do you have a personal measure of success when you will feel that the task force recommendations and the culture at WAMU have reached a better place than they were in 2020?
I do. And, anecdotally, I think that is when the noise subsides and people start behaving differently and people are enthusiastic and optimistic about the new environment. I think we'll be able to, when I start to hear that, I'll start to feel like we're getting there. But in the meantime, we decided to distribute a workplace survey so that we have a benchmark for where we're starting from. Everyone tells me that we're doing a lot better than we were this time last year. And of course, I take them at their word, but we still have a long way to go. So keep it with that in mind, having a baseline for where we are today and measuring how people feel over the next year is going to be really instrumental in helping us grade ourselves or assess our own growth and development.
I've been here a lot longer than you have, 30 plus years. WAMU has always been in the background at my house, in our car as we drive around. I'm a news junkie, and listen to the station in the morning, listen to it in the afternoon when there are major stories breaking and I'm not in front of a television set. When you came to the station, knowing that all this background noise was there, did you ever have second thoughts about accepting the job? Ever have second thoughts about saying, maybe this is not the place I want to be?
Never once crossed my mind. It didn't. I knew that they needed me and I stepped up to the challenge. And like I said, I love the station, I love the city, and I was ready for it.
One of the things in the report that sort of surprised me was this focus on improving the relationship between AU, American University, and the station itself. I guess I wasn't aware that there had grown such a gap between the licensee, the university, and the people at the radio station. With the proposals that the task force came up with on improving the relationship, are there things that listeners will eventually hear? Will there be something tangible that people will know, oh, they're working much more hand in glove than they did in the past?
Possibly, if we cover some of the efforts that we have to collaborate with one another that we might be working towards. There are some early conversations that are taking place now about collaborating with the School of Communications. So there could be some visibility in that regard. But otherwise, it's really about strengthening the relationship in a way that's productive and the university supports our work. Not that the university has never supported our work. I want to be clear about that. They do. They value the station tremendously. But the university is in the business of educating students. And WAMU is in a different category. That's not our primary focus. We're interested in educating the community. And so it's broader than that, and AU does recognize that, so they support our work, but some of the policies that the university has in place, might not, or at least the staff feels like they don't relate to our work that we do on a day-to-day basis. I think there's always been a little bit of tension between universities and public radio stations. They're not just WAMU and American University. That tension has always been there around those policies that apply to you, but don't necessarily weren't created for you. And that tension is, I think that's it. In my experience in my past 90 days here, I haven't experienced that in a significant way. I think perception sometimes is a lot of people's realities, and I don't experience it at my level.
Are there elements of this task force report, which I understand all about WAMU, all about the circumstances of a year and a half ago, but are there elements that you see as being helpful or beneficial for other public stations to follow? AMU is not the only station that has an affiliation with or is part of a university. Are there steps that public radio stations nationwide ought to be thinking about or following? And I ask that question because of your experience, not just in Orlando, but for many years at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Yeah, one of the things that we did just a couple of weeks ago now is we took a field trip to the university. The station is not housed on campus. It's on Connecticut Avenue, and the university is more on Wisconsin or off of New Hampshire. And so it's we got on the bus and took several staff members over to the university. The objective was to capture a lot of new staff that we had hired to help with their onboarding and orientation process, so that they understand that we're part of a organization that's bigger than just the station and our house at 4401 Connecticut Avenue. So it was good, got a history of the station. Colleagues from the university came over, had lunch with us. Our tower is on the campus. We got a beautiful tour of the tower. The technology team did a great job with the tower. I know there was a kind of refurbishment project that they completed, and it was a really wonderful day. And it was another just like easy kind of check the box thing that got people out of the station on what was the coldest day of the year at the time. But it was great to be out on a sunny day outside of the office, engaging with colleagues from the station as well as the university, having a lunch, understanding the towers here. And it brought it all together for people, I think, in a way that may not have been done before. So if stations are not on their college campus the way we are not, that might be a good exercise to help people understand that dynamic of being larger than what you see every day.
What was the reaction of the people you took over to the campus? Had some of them never been on the campus before?
Several of them had never been on the campus before. I had been on the campus before on some other, personal business. I had come over to the university campus some years ago, but we had one of our colleagues who has been at the station for almost 20 years had said that he had never had an experience like that in all his time working here, that he had been to campus plenty of times, but he hadn't gotten the tour, he hadn't gotten the history of the campus, he hadn't had the tower tour. And so, those are that's low-hanging fruit, to be honest. And so we got some really strong positive feedback, and that's something that we're going to incorporate as a kind of a bi-yearly thing, biannual, in the spring and the fall when the weather is conducive to that sort of thing, so that we can just keep that momentum going and we don't fall back.
Sounds like a good, at least first step to improve the relations between the two. I know that it's early in your tenure at WAMU, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on the report, any more time on the report. Is this a process that will have an end point? Is there a spot in 2022, 2023, 2024 when the implementation is done and WAMU is on a different trajectory than it was in 2020?
I think there is. I think there is an end date. It's hard to predict when it is, but I envision that the task force recommendations will evolve into standard operating procedures, practices, and policies that are live within the organization long after I'm gone. And that we actually embrace the changes that the task force recommended and incorporate them into our day-to-day work, so that the task force and the problems of the past are really a distant reminder, but the outcomes remain the same.
Let me take you to another issue, not as contentious an issue, perhaps. The station announced before your arrival a significant expansion in the news department. News has always been an important part of WAMU. Junkies like me turn to the station when news is happening. Those 8 positions, that's a pretty dramatic expansion for any radio station in the country at a time when the broadcasters are retrenching, stations are changing format and de-emphasizing news and public affairs. Have you been participating in the discussion of what areas will be covered with these new reporters that are being hired?
Yeah, I have. So there's an expansion of the newsroom and also a realignment of the newsroom. 2 things are happening at the same time. The expansion efforts really revolve around expanding our service outside of the DC proper community and getting into some of the inner counties of the Washington, DC metro area, including Fairfax, Montgomery, and Prince George's counties. Just in our audience numbers, we know that we have significant audience in Montgomery County and DC, and less of a significant audience in Fairfax and Prince George's County. And those are real opportunities for us, the way we see it, due to the population there, and they, by and large, many people there meet our demographic in terms of college educated, upperly mobile, and those sorts of things. But then at the same time, we're also increasing service to some of the non-traditional public radio audiences, for example, in Ward 7 and 8 of DC. So that's a region, an area within the region that has not been historically covered well by us or anybody else for that matter. We've got some new beats that we incorporated, including a beat around immigration, a new beat around criminal justice, and some of our beats have been incorporated into broader categories. For example, education is now captured in social, which also includes arts and culture. And the idea here is that, just like back in the good old days, you could open up the newspaper and turn to the metro area of the newspaper or the arts and culture area of the newspaper, and you could get a story there. And so we're just trying to make sure that we're covering all aspects of news across our region so that we have something for everybody.
And are all 8 positions now filled, or are you still looking for candidates for those jobs?
We are very close to being filled. I think we might have maybe 2 positions that are very close to being filled, but we filled quite a few. I think there's 1 offer out and 1 in the final stages of the interview process. I don't have the latest information as of today. For all I know, they could be new hires today and we could be done. But like every other organization, we've experienced some turnover. And so we've got resignations that we're also filling for and that kind of thing. So it's a lot of HR work right now for the organization in terms of recruiting and hiring good people.
Are you putting any special programming in place to accommodate the expanded news generation, the news output, or will this just be appearing on the local news inserts on All Things Considered and Morning Edition and any local programming that WAMU does?
Yeah, we're having conversations now about, how to replace the Kojo Nambi show that sunset. I think it was earlier this year, around March or so. Kojo had been such a staple in the DC community for decades now. And he has decided to hang up the mic, and he's still out, doing Kojo in the community, I think on a monthly basis. And but how we fill that void of having our own daily 1-hour block of programming is a question that we're having now. There is some tension though between where to place our bets. This is a very interesting time in media with broadcast listening becoming less. People are still coming to the broadcasts. Let me first say that,
Right.
but we do see shrinking is probably an overstatement, but a decreased level of listening year over year that we are trying to stay ahead of. So there's tensions around whether or not our bets are better placed in the local daily show or in some other digital news service or outlet.
WAMU does have some podcasts and does have some of those social media platforms. It sounds like you're suggesting maybe there should be an acceleration or could be an acceleration to create more opportunities for production output in social media, not necessarily turn on the radio dial at 1 o'clock or noon to hear a particular program.
I think we have to do both. I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think, our mission is to be good news providers, and that means content is king, and it goes across all platforms that are available to us, including our internet, podcasting, as well as our broadcasts. I don't think my opinion is that they are equally important to our future.
Erika, we're starting to get some questions from people who are joining us this evening, and one person wants to know to explain the relationship between WAMU and one of those online platforms, DCist, which has been part of the AMU family since I think 2008. What's the back and forth? What's the relationship between the online DCist and the radio station?
Yeah, I think WAMU acquired DCist in 2018. It was.
Sorry, you're right.
It was an independent digital news startup operation back then. We acquired it in 2018. And during those early years, they were kind of independent operations. DCist operated the way it operated, WAMU operated the way it operated. But this past year, we did a realignment of those two services. So we have one large newsroom now. And there is no distinction between which reporters report for the DCist and which reporters report for WAMU. The distinction is whether or not the reporter works on a digital story or a broadcast story. And generally, a broadcast story lives on air and online, so it gives it a longer shelf life.
When I worked at Bloomberg, there used to be a requirement that you had to produce your material for the terminal first, and then you could put the material on the website and on any social media. Is the same practice followed at WAMU? It has to be broadcast first, or do they operate independently through that central newsroom?
Yeah, they operate independently through that central newsroom. There is no broadcast first approach here. It's content first, and then we decide which platform it's served best on.
Let me. One of our longtime members here likes to ask this question of people when we do these sorts of discussions: what does local journalism mean to you, and why is local journalism important?
Local journalism to me means what's going on in the community I live in. And it means how do I stay informed about the important issues in my community? It means where I can go to find the information I need to make wise decisions, whether that is where to get a COVID vaccine, how to get a COVID vaccine, what our COVID numbers are. COVID was the story of the past year. And that information at the local level is more valuable than to an individual than the CNN story or even the NPR story, because they're covering a national landscape, but it's the local. You need to know what's going on in your local community and what your local numbers are to help you make those wise decisions for yourself.
Of course, Washington is more than just a local city. I live in Ward 6 on Capitol Hill. The national political scene, the national government, is also a big story. A lot of people here work for the national government. How do you balance that being local journalism for people in Washington versus what NPR covers from the national level?
That's a great question. And we have a separate politics and government beat as part of the newsroom expansion. And so they really focus more on a lot of the local politics and government issues. But there are times when the two converge. For example, January 6th, when the riot at the Capitol took place, that was certainly a national and a local story at the same time, but we tackled it from the local perspective.
And does that ever create conflicts for the staff in terms of, does that ever create conflicts for the staff in terms of let NPR do the story, or we're going to do the story because we can do a better job for our listeners?
I don't think so. I think our newsroom is a very collaborative group. There are times when NPR reaches out to our newsroom to cover stories for them, and we do that pretty frequently. So when we do a national or a local story that has national relevance, we often tend to do that for NPR specifically when they call us and ask us, or we have a story that we think would serve NPR's audience as well nationally. We can also offer it to them, let them know that we have it. So the relationship with NPR is a good, strong collaboration, if you will. And so we don't really have tension in the newsroom around that because we have an avenue.
How much of a draw for donors is the news programming versus the public affairs programming or the other programming that the station provides? Is news the driver of why people make the donations to the station?
That's a great question, Steve, and certainly one that we'll need to look into further as we make that decision around whether or not we invest in the national public affairs show or more news. I'm of the opinion that we have, because we are a relatively small organization, we have to maximize the output of, or the outcome of the content we produce, that it can, if we do a news story, is there a public affairs element that we can build on with that story so that there's alignment across everything that we do and not have individual buckets of activity, but have all activity kind of going in the same direction, because I think that just will help us leverage the content that the newsroom produces and lessen the burden on the public affairs program to produce a new show every day on something totally different.
Erika, we have two more questions from the people who have joined us this evening. One from one of our members. You're clearly committed to WAMU. Is your contract with the station and the university open-ended? Is it a set contract for 5 years, 3 years, or the standard in television, 13 weeks? Or are there extensions possible, if you feel free discussing that?
I will just say that it is open-ended for now.
Okay. All right, thank you. Another question from another member of the local chapter. Do you have any way of measuring the impact of less drive time in the DC area due to more people now working at home, not getting in their car to drive to and from an office, or not spending time on metro or a bus going to and from the office? And alternatively, has the audience picked up because more people are listening at home?
So what we saw happen over the past year and a half is a significant decline in broadcast audience as people return to work from home. In-car listening reached, record low numbers over those 18 or so months. In September, we started to see some recovery of that. And in October, we had our highest broadcast listening since March of 2020. So we are seeing some recovery, but it's still not at pre-pandemic levels. But the one thing about the WAMU audience that is unique, and that is that it's very, very loyal. And AQH is still strong. Our share of ear across the region remains strong. We were #1 in the region in October, which is back up because we had dropped down to 3 or 4 in August and September, but October put us back on top. I think more people are returning to work these days, and that's what the traffic tells me every morning. And so I think that those audiences are starting to return. It's broadcast listening took a decline, but it's the numbers that we're seeing now are very encouraging.
What about listenership and downloads of the podcast that the station generates?
Yeah, we have some pretty popular podcasts that we produce. We are getting ready to enter into, I think it's season 4 of Dish City, the podcast on food across the region. The podcast, the investigative journalism podcast Through the Cracks, that did just 1 season, is nominated for lots of awards in this award season here. And it is approaching 1 million downloads as I talked to you this evening. Last numbers last week or so, more 900 and some odd thousand downloads. So I think we're expected to cross that threshold before the end of the calendar year.
And in your mind, are there podcasts that the station should launch? I mean, we talked a little bit about this in the expansion of the newsroom, but you personally, is there some program or some topic or theme you think, we got to find the right person and we just have to do it because the times demand it?
Yeah, I think there's a podcast around government, the federal government, that there is a story there. And there could be lots of editorial directions that story can take, whether it be government, how things are done, in New Hampshire, for example. They have a podcast called Civics 101, which is all about how government operates. The target for that audience are 8th grade students. It's for young listeners, and they use educational resources and guides. And that was something that we funded at the CPB while I was there. I was, leading the efforts in the podcast space. So there are more opportunities like that for us here, especially here in Washington, that I think we can tell a really good story around and could get some new ears.
So in other words, stay tuned to your nearest podcast platform.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Another question from one of our folks out in the audience: with the local journalism market still shrinking, maybe not at WAMU, but in other platforms, other venues, do you have any recommendations for young journalist students, what they should do to gain experience writing for podcasts, creating their own podcasts, knocking on your door to get a gig on the weekends or late nights or whatever? What advice would you have to those who want to get into the business that we're both in?
Absolutely. And those internship opportunities or part-time opportunities, I would definitely recommend pursuing those. And at WAMU or any other public radio station, one of the things about public radio station is that we do a lot with a little. And there are always opportunities to get some experience and some mentoring from some of the journalists within our organization. I think that's one. And there are other journalism organizations. I know SPJ is one, it's national, and this is the local chapter. But there are other journalism organizations that you can also look into. In public media, we have something called the Public Media Journalism Association. They changed their name recently, so I had to think about what the acronym meant for a minute. So excuse me. But the PMJA, they're a resource. I think it would be really cool to, if I was running that organization, I would really be working on how to keep a strong pipeline of promising journalists, because stations are always looking for reporters. It's just, that's the nature of the business. And there was an organization that did some of this for public media in the past, but they seem to have gone quiet recently. But yeah, we need a strong pipeline of journalists and other content creators in public media, and I would recommend that avenue.
You have piqued a lot of interest on the part of people who are listening to us tonight. Several more questions have come across the transom. What do you see as the ideal mix of news and information programming versus other programming at WAMU? And do you see any trends in radio nationally that ought to be adopted at WAMU?
Sure. Well, the mix of news and other programming across WAMU is that, through the week, we focus on hard news mostly. And on the weekend, we focus on, a little lighter fare, if you will. We've got the big broadcast on the weekend. We've got Jazz Saturday night on the weekend. Those are more entertainment oriented programs. Wait, Don't Tell Me is a lightweight news program. And Sam Sanders, same thing, still covering news, but in a lighthearted conversational way. And so that's how we have balanced the hard news versus other programming across the station. And in the evening hours, we do more of that as well, with like TED Radio Hour and things like that.
And do you have a percentage in mind, 50% hard news, 50% other types of programming, or does it ebb and flow as the day progresses or the week progresses?
It ebbs and flows. A lot of that is dictated by the news cycle, right? If we've got some important pressing news that needs to be covered, that's where we're going to put our attention right now. But we've got an arts and entertainment or arts and culture reporter, Elliot, that reports for us. That's his sole beat, is arts and culture, and so he there's always an arts and culture story, just to help balance some of the hard news. Some of that's the feel good stuff.
Are you watching, or I should say, listening to any of the competition in Washington, any of the other stations? One of our listeners tonight wants to know if you're looking at WPFW to see what they're up to as a locally focused broadcaster.
Yeah, I see that. I'm familiar with WPFW, and in fact, I had the luxury of meeting their general manager kind of randomly at a friend's house. He's her neighbor. I've known about PFW for many years because my father was a listener of PFW and their Saturday morning programming, and particularly the music. So I am more familiar with their music, but I do know that they do have more progressive content for their audience. They have a lot of credibility with audiences that, may not be typically served well by public media. For example, in some of the Ward 7 and 8 or Prince George's County, for example. So I'm familiar with them, and I know they do some things, but I can't say that I've focused on what they're doing since I've been back in town the past 3 months.
One of the other people listening to us wants to know why so much Canadian and BBC programming in the late night, early morning hours on WAMU.
That's kind of an economic decision. The BBC programming is, we broadcast the BBC NewsHour at 9 a.m. and then there's, some of the overnight stuff. It's affordable. There are no restrictions on how much or how little we broadcast. So because we pay for it, and it's not a very listened to hour of the day. You know, most people are not listening in the late night hours, so it's there and it's on. And it's just, it's not a prudent place to invest in content during that hour.
I'll tell you, I listen to the 9 o'clock hour because as somebody who doesn't have to go to work anymore, either at home or in the office, I enjoy listening to the international flavor of the World Report from the BBC, and perhaps a little bit of having spent 3 years in London, listening to the BBC as my wake-up radio station.
Oh,
I like to hear stories from other parts of the world that won't make it to NPR or any of the broadcast stations in the United States.
it's true. And that's one of the reasons why we carry the BBC NewsHour. It's one of our most popular programmings. We have a lot of international people in the Washington region. And so, you know, that international news coverage is very important to our audience, and we are committed to it.
You spent 15 years at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Correct.
What experiences in that job, in that environment, helped you prepare to be first in Orlando as the general manager at WFME and now here in Washington?
You know, the CPB experience was very interesting. You know, I joined in 2005 at a time when the organization itself was going through a transition. Maybe this is my life mission, to join organizations in transition, but it was going through a transition. I really started my career in private industry, in pharmaceutical industry, to be specific. And so I had a lot of, you know, general business skills that wasn't necessarily focused on creating content. And CPB, you know, when I joined the organization, was full of a lot of producers and folks like that had all of the creative skills, but not a lot of the business skills. And so I came in and I helped create the structure and the systems and the processes and the plans that help really professionalize our grant making operations, because that's what the CPB is. It's a grant making organization. And that has helped me and prepared me to kind of go to WMFE in Orlando and now here WAMU in DC, and bring some of that systems and structures and things in place that may not have been in Orlando or here in DC.
What was the biggest surprise? This is spoken as a guy who spent a lot of time in radio studios and control rooms and radio stations. When you went to FME, when you went to your first site visit with Corporation for Public Broadcasting, what was the first thing that surprised you about how radio works?
Surprised me about how radio works. Well, I'm trying to think where my first station visit was. It's so long ago now, I don't even know. But I know that I've been to, one thing about public radio that we say is, if you've been to one public radio station, you've been to one public radio station, because they're all very different. I've been to large stations like ours here in DC and in New York, and I've also been to very, very small organizations in some not so populous places in the Midwest or the West or the South. So there's a very disparate operation across public media. There, you know, just 400 and some stations, and they're all operating somewhere on the spectrum. I think, you know, we have a really professional operation at WAMU. We have, you know, equipment that's fully operational, and, you know, professionalism with our sponsorship messaging and our underwriting operation and the traffic associated with that. But then we go to other stations and they don't have the same level of resources that WAMU has, the same level of generosity and from their audience that WAMU has. And so there are some stations that still make it happen with the people that are committed to the service that we provide. And it's just different. And so I can't say that there's anything that surprised me at my first visit about how radio operates, but what did surprise me is how differently radio operates.
It's always magic what comes out of the box at the other end for
It is.
a lot of people who don't necessarily see all the bells and whistles or the bubble gum and baling wire that sometimes keep stations put together, especially the smaller stations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They do make magic.
So with the pandemic cutting routines for people in terms of commuting and even in their daily lives, it also affected fundraising for some stations. The situation at WAMU a year ago might have also affected fundraising. How do things stand today for WAMU specifically in terms of getting fundraising, ramping up the amount of money that's required to keep the station going?
Our audience stepped up for us. And we did experience a significant decline in revenue, primarily due to reduction in sponsorship revenue from our business community. But our listeners and our donors, they stepped up to the challenge. And we are having a tight fiscal year. We're not at pre-pandemic level at all, but we are making a slow recovery in that regard. But our donors have not stopped donating, and we just wrapped up a very strong fall fundraising campaign in September, October. It seems like it was recently, and we met our goal, $1.2 million. And that generosity of our audience keeps us going, because it's the endorsement that what we do matters, and people know that it matters, and they're willing to support us in our mission.
I was astonished when I saw that the corporate fundraising as well as the individual fundraising, the membership in 2020, the latest fiscal year, accounted for more than 50% of all the money, all the revenue that the station derived, which I think is a testament to the loyalty of the people in the area, people who appreciate what WAMU is doing on a day-to-day basis.
That's right. That's right. We couldn't do this without our audience, without our donors.
Should we expect to see some different types of fundraising events over the next year? Things that you have found successful either at WFME or at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that people in Washington will get to experience?
Yeah, we had some things planned for the 60th anniversary, some fundraising events planned for the 60th anniversary, but due to the pandemic, of course, we have postponed them to hopefully the spring. We're seeing, I don't know if you guys are experiencing this on, with your meetings, but we're seeing some Zoom fatigue in our virtual audience. So, we thought, that might not be the great revenue maker that we would hope that it would be to host it on Zoom platform, and we're holding it until the fall and until the spring. And so I won't say too much about that now, because I wanted to make a big splash when we do.
The anniversary celebration can continue well into next year. Lots of symphony orchestras extended their Beethoven celebration because they had to cancel performances during his anniversary year. So still opportunities down the road. Yeah.
We're all pivoting.
Another question from the folks who are watching: considering the success of Hot Jazz Saturday Night, a very popular program on WAMU, which was gone, then it's back, any consideration of introducing other genres of music to time periods, either on the weekend, late night, or on the alternate stations?
That's a great question. And it's actually the second time I received that question in probably the past week. There is an appetite for music. And I think that's been demonstrated with how the audience responded to Hot Jazz Saturday Night coming back. And so again, thinking about where the opportunities are and what WAMU's unique value proposition is to the market is really important. And we're still trying to figure out what our relationship with music is going to be. We don't have that nailed down yet, but it's on the radar.
One of our listeners also talks about pointing your attention to a station, I believe it's in Kansas, where they do a retro cocktail hour. It's KANU. It's broadcast from the Underground Martini Bunker, which is one more version of programming. It was suggested you give that a check that out. KANU. I believe that's in Kansas.
I think I know that station, and I think I know the manager there, and I think I can certainly give her a call and say, what do you got going on with your retro cocktail hour? One of my audience members knew all about it, so fill me in. So it's worth looking into.
So Erika, we're getting to the final 5 minutes of our time together here this evening. I got to have a couple of questions that I've held to the end because they're really appropriate ending questions. One of them is, we've talked a little bit about podcasts at WAMU. What are your favorite podcasts? What do you listen to when you have the opportunity to put earbuds in or pop something that's not live radio on your car dash radio?
Well, my favorite podcast is TED Radio Hour. And I know it's also a broadcast program, but I listen to it on the podcast more regularly. I always learn something new. I also often get a fresh perspective from TED Radio Hours, a lot of non-traditional thought processes, and just broadens my frame of mind and my perspective on a lot of things that I think I know that I might not know. So that's my favorite. Another one is Death, Sex, and Money from WNYC Studios. I like that it tackles tough subjects, the three things that nobody ever wants to talk about or said that we shouldn't talk about, death, sex, and money. It's controversial. And I know that when they had that program and they really thought about what to name it, the story is that the consultant said, don't name it Death, Sex, and Money. All of the research said, don't name it that, and they did. And it's one of my favorites.
At least they didn't use taxes in the title.
No, taxes would have been dead on arrival.
Exactly. So you were in Orlando for a little over a year. What did you miss about Washington when you were in Orlando?
What I missed most was the restaurant scene. We have great restaurants in Washington, and I'm pescatarian, so I'm a bit of a finicky eater. And in Orlando, there were a lot of burgers, and there was a lot of, they just didn't have the same fruity vibe that DC has. I love the restaurants. I miss that the most.
So now that you're back in Washington, how are you going to get used to the cold weather? This is a question, again, from one of our listeners. I'll actually identify him. He's Tom Sherwood, who is very active in Washington journalism. What are you going to do to get used to the cold weather again, especially on this, we're really cold this week
We are.
after the little more than a year in Orlando?
Well, good thing is I'm from New Jersey, so I am no stranger to cold weather. And I know how to layer, and I know how to wear a hat and gloves, and I'll be just fine. I will acclimate back to this cooler climate in no time, I'm sure.
Well, you're getting a workout, certainly the last couple of days on cold weather. Do you have any message you want to leave with us about your direction for WAMU over the next several months, years, and beyond?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has taken the time to log in on this Zoom webinar and hear me speak. I appreciate your interest in WAMU. I think I speak for not just myself, but I speak for the entire staff and the university as well. We are writing a new story for WAMU. And the story of yesterday will be the story of yesterday. Despite all of the challenges that the organization has faced over the last year or so, it's also a good organization. It's a strong organization. Everything that has happened at WAMU and the culture is not bad or toxic. That there are some good things that are happening that we're going to keep in place, and we're going to put the systems and processes in place to make sure that we build on that and have a stronger future. And so stay tuned, keep listening, keep watching, and I look forward to one day meeting you all, maybe at the conference next year.
Or at some good restaurant in Washington.
Oh, absolutely.
Erika Pulley-Hayes, thank you very much for spending some time with us this afternoon and this evening to talk about WAMU, to talk about your interests in promoting the station and rebuilding the station, building it better. We've really appreciated the candor and the time you've taken to spend with us. Thanks again, and good luck.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.